traveling preacher and family man.
Stay vigilant, my brothers and sisters.
With a secret.
I don't know who you are, but you're lying to me.
Mr. Richardson had been leading a double life.
Washes up on the murky banks.
Oh my God.
This was definitely the first time I had seen someone killed with an arrow.
Was this man of God targeted by a sadistic killer?
No, please, don't!
Or did he face a demon of another sort? Ford Island Gulf Beach is a man-made strip of sand, barely holding off the swamp that surrounds it in Citrus County, Florida.
There's snakes, alligators, and there's even been panthers seen out there.
As the sun sets, this dense wetland turns pitch black. Only the nocturnal wildlife bears witness to any unusual activities. Like a man gasping for his last breath. It's August 27th, 2001, and the swampy cove is already oppressively muggy at 10:30 a.m. A local fisherman spies something peculiar floating near the muddy bank off in the distance.
He thought at first it was a manatee that had washed up on shore, and upon closer inspection,
Oh my God.
A call came out that there was a possibly drowned person in the water at the Ford Island Gulf Beach.
Sure enough, where the marshland melts into murky liquid is an unmistakable form of a human body, marinating in stagnant water and blood.
He looked like a middle-aged man, approximately 250 pounds.
We got a 10-7 here at Ford Island Gulf Beach. Looks like a male possible shooting.
It appeared as though it was an unnatural death. There was a lot of blood at the scene. There was some maturation of his skin, which means that his skin had absorbed some water. It became wrinkly.
Detectives Dixon and Pleffel arrived to process the decomposing body.
Kind of odd. You don't see slacks and loafers on the beach too often.
Yeah, I wonder where he's coming from. Or where he was going.
No wallet or ID is found on the John Doe, but a closer inspection reveals the bizarre way he died.
I don't see an entrance or an exit wound. How about you? No? Let's roll him over. See what we can find here. Wow, come on.
After we turned him over, we found a wound in his chest. There was a center hole with 3 lines coming out from it.
Take a look at this. Is that what I think it is?
It's no bullet hole or even a knife wound. Detective Dixon, an experienced hunter, recognizes the entry pattern and can't believe his eyes.
The wound in his left chest, very consistent with the broadhead of a hunting arrow.
I think somebody used their bullet for target practice. Might have punctured his heart. How deep do you think it goes? There's no telling, but it explains all the blood.
This was definitely the first time I had seen someone killed with an arrow.
The only other injuries are minor scrapes on the victim's arms and tiny bites on his face, presumably from small fish after his death. Clearly, the chest wound was the fatal blow. The swampy water is wreaking havoc on crucial evidence, making the detective's job even tougher.
Footprints could have been washed away. They could really hurt us on crime scene.
All detectives have is a dead body and a couple of pieces from what looked to be the weapon, a hunting arrow. Was this John Doe simply an unlucky victim of a hunting accident? Detectives can't rule out any theories, even suicide.
A wound like that can absolutely be self-inflicted. I could shove it through my chest more easily than I could a knife.
The autopsy will hopefully give detectives the answers. 40 yards from the body, near the dense woods, is a red Chevy truck with the driver's door wide open.
If it's murder, the killer was an expert shot. Indiana plate. Still got keys in the ignition.
There didn't seem to be any signs of foul play, no struggle.
Bible. Suit jacket. Suit pants. Got a wallet. Let's see what we got. Kenneth Richardson, and that is definitely our victim.
We determined it was Kenneth R. Richardson from Indiana, who was 59 years old.
It's a long way from home. Business card here, Homosassa address. Probably a snowbird.
Detectives come across items that suggest Ken Richardson came to Florida for more than just the sunshine.
In the truck, we found a lot of religious materials, things that indicated he was a minister or preacher.
Hearing your dad's dead is a very difficult thing to hear. I was 25 years old. Losing my dad was devastating.
Wendy tells detectives her father had been in Florida for 2 weeks to work on the couple's retirement home and do a little preaching.
How can this have happened?
We don't know yet, ma'am, but I promise you we are gonna find out.
My dad's 60th birthday is next week. He was supposed to be back before then. I can't believe that he's gone.
My mom was devastated. She had been married to my dad since she was 17, and that was her life partner.
According to Wendy, her dad last spoke to her mom around 10 p.m. the night before.
Oh, honey, you should have seen it. It was fantastic. The congregation, they were in tears. Yes. You could feel the Spirit of the Lord in the house that night tonight. You could feel it. Okay, honey. I will talk to you tomorrow. Love you too. Bye-bye.
But the preacher never said his prayers that night. Instead, he took a cure.
As you can see, it missed his heart. Barely.
The next morning, the medical examiner confirms the shocking way in which Ken was slaughtered.
When an arrow enters the body, it cuts by means of a razor blade.
The autopsy x-ray clearly shows a 7-inch arrow shaft still inside the victim.
It did puncture his lung, which would have filled it with blood fairly quickly.
So he bled out.
Most likely he suffocated on his own blood.
Not an instant death, very painful death.
The medical examiner concludes Ken's death was no suicide.
Not instant.
Police interview friends and neighbors of the victim to find out who might have wanted to harm the lovable preacher.
Can you think of anyone that would want to hurt Mr. Richardson?
When I heard, I was just flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. I thought, why would somebody want to hurt this man?
He was well-liked, well-respected.
He wasn't a rich or wealthy man. He worked all of his life in physical hard work.
Despite the long hours working construction, Ken always made time for his 2 children.
I loved my dad tremendously and got treated like the princess, raised me in church, and wanted me to, be a God-fearing young lady.
You're gonna do great.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to church.
But everyone knew Ken's true calling was to preach the Pentecostal faith.
He'd been a preacher since I was a young kid. It was a life's passion to spread the word of God.
As I prepare sermons, I often think of the things that I need to hear. So this message is as much for me as it is for you. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins.
He was an evangelist, which is basically you go from church to church and preach.
Ephesians 5:18 instructs us, do not get drunk on wine.
We would travel a lot, holding revivals.
Instead, be filled with the Holy Spirit, praise God.
No doubt about it, Ken had a gift for preaching the Word of God. But he also had a secret stumbling block when it came to learning the Word of God.
My dad could not read or write, so he couldn't even read the Bible. He had the whole Bible on tape, and he would listen to those so he could learn the Bible and get it written on his heart.
In Ken's view, being a good preacher to the flock wasn't about reading the good book. It was about reaching people through performance.
Oh, praise God.
My dad was very energetic. He didn't stand still when he preached. He would bring props.
Is not my word like fire, declared the Lord? And like that hammer that breaks the rock. Glory, hallelujah.
He would come across a sermon in his head that God would put there, and then he would find the pieces to go with it that people would understand.
Brothers and sisters, tonight, the devil is in the house. I can feel it. I can feel the devil's in the house. He's telling you to not shout, not get up and dance, not say anything, but that's not the way the Lord wants you to be happy.
He would utilize people that were in the congregations and use them to help him preach. He loved to bring them up and bring them into his sermons.
Ooh, what a great, glorious, spirit-filled night we've had. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for coming.
And they would get so much joy out of it.
So stay vigilant, my brothers and sisters. Stay pure in thought, because one wrong step and you will find yourself in a hornet's nest. And you know what happens when you're near a hornet's nest? Those mean old things come out. Amen. Now we're talking.
When Ken retired, he carried his religious fervor to Florida.
So you see, that passage explains God's love for us. Let's have a word of prayer.
And it was his well-known zeal for bringing people to Jesus that got the town tongue speculating.
Neighbors thought that maybe he tried to minister to someone who took offense.
Took loss, brother.
Maybe Mr. Richardson had been too persistent in trying to get his message across.
Jesus loves you.
Just a day after the body is found, police get their first tip.
Citrus County Sheriff's Department, this is Detective Dixon. How can I help you?
We got a call from a lady that lived on the same street with Mr. Richardson. She told us about a gentleman she saw driving Mr. Richardson's truck on Friday, which is 2 days prior to his murder.
Police bring in a sketch artist.
Oh, I remember the mustache. It was real full.
Is this him?
That's the guy.
The sketch was of a white male with straight, kind of thin hair, kind of a bushy mustache.
It's all they have to go on, so authorities release the composite drawing to the public.
When the community sees a composite sketch, they try to match it to anybody they know. They try to match it to anybody they've seen. And it could be somebody they saw on vacation, it could be somebody they see in their daily travels, it could be the poor person that works at the grocery store. It's not always the suspect or the subject.
And they emphasized that at least at that moment, that person was not a suspect, that he was just someone that police were looking to talk to in order to get some more information about the crime.
What a sketch does, it gives a lead. It gives a direction. So it's not always the right person, but it does give direction. And that's exactly what that sketch did.
We received many tips, some of them very bizarre.
Homicide Detective Level. Homicide Detective Dixon, how can I help you?
No, ma'am, I don't think he was killed by a terrorist. Thank you very much.
For every 100 crazy tips, there's one that makes detectives' ears perk up.
Homicide Detective Level. Excuse me, I'll have to call you back.
The call was from an Indiana phone number in the victim's hometown.
Do you have a current address? Hung up on me, but I got a guy who's 99% sure that our sketch is a man named Wayne Warner.
According to the anonymous tipster, Warner is the spitting image of the sketch. And he used to work at the same factory as Ken's wife in Indiana. It's their best lead yet. A background search on Wayne Warner confirms he spent time in both Indiana and Florida, just like the victim.
Okay, sit here. He doesn't have a hunting license, but he does have a concealed weapons permit.
They also did a stint at the construction company that Richardson retired from.
Interesting. So he worked with the victim and the victim's wife also.
Yep, at different places.
The more we followed up on him, we thought maybe that he might be our person.
But attempts to find a current address for Wayne Warner in Indiana or Florida come up empty.
Address no good.
For such a promising lead, it's stalling out fast.
We did a lot of things to try and track him down, didn't have any luck.
Then a young woman comes forward with an eyewitness report of Ken Richardson's vehicle on the night he was killed.
I was on a date with my boyfriend at the beach, and I saw a red truck in the parking lot.
The witness also saw a blue car parked next to Ken Richardson's red truck.
We left around 2 a.m., and both the truck and the car were still there.
Unfortunately, the witness didn't catch the license plate, which makes it nearly impossible for police to locate the right blue car.
Pardon me, ma'am. Do you recognize either of these two gentlemen?
Detectives question beachgoers to see if anyone else can shed light on this new information. Turns out Ken Richardson frequented the beach quite often and had a routine.
My dad loved the beach. That was one of his favorite places to go and sit and listen to the ocean or watch the sunset.
Several people reported to us that when he would arrive at the beach, he would go and float on a raft out in the water for about 45 minutes.
Then he would come back onto land and he would meet up with a man and, you know, spend some time with that particular person.
Great day to be on the water. Hi, I'm Ken.
My dad didn't know a stranger. He would find something in common with anyone he met, and eventually he would talk about God to them as well.
Investigators wonder, could Ken's outgoing nature have put him in danger? Then, 1 week after Ken's murder, detectives get an urgent call from his wife, Wanda.
Detective Dixon? Yes, I need to ask you a favor.
She was needing the death certificate because there was a $10,000 life insurance policy that she stand to gain from, and also his pension would be paid to her.
Why won't he issue the death certificate? Isn't there something he can do?
Because of the nature of the crime and the way that the medical examiner's office works, it was going to be some time before that happened.
They wouldn't release the cause of death because they felt that was crucial to the investigation.
Why does he have to wait for the final autopsy to be done? I need this money now.
They were obviously upset that it was going to take some time.
The phone call gives detectives pause. Police believe Ken's killer must have been an avid hunter given the cause of death. And Wanda Richardson is no hunter. Still, Ken's wife seems awfully interested in getting paid.
Could there be somebody else involved that links back to her or another family member? We had to look at everybody.
Perhaps it was just supposed to look like a hunting accident.
People will do strange things to get money, and they'll do terrible things to get money.
Three weeks of high and low tides have covered the shores where 59-year-old evangelist Ken Richardson was fatally shot with a hunting arrow and left floating in the muggy Gulf Coast swamp.
With what little we knew, everybody but myself was a suspect.
Including the preacher's wife.
Say amen!
Amen!
Who detectives believe could have arranged a hunting accident in Florida while keeping her hands clean in Indiana. Detectives plan to question Wanda Richardson when she shows up to retrieve her husband's belongings. But for now, they chase leads on person of interest, Wayne Warner.
How many more addresses we got on that checklist?
Gone through a dozen or so.
Warner matches the police sketch of a man a witness claims she saw driving Ken's red truck 2 days before the murder.
Is this him?
That's the guy.
But Mr. Warner is proving to be as hard to catch as a catfish with your bare hands. Investigators head back to the beach to see if any other witnesses will come forward with more information. And they get a bombshell.
Several people reported seeing him go off in his vehicle or off into the wooded area with other males.
The woods near the beach is very secluded. It is a place that men would meet up and have these sort of illicit encounters.
This new information contradicts everything detectives know about the devout preacher.
You doing okay?
He was on a gold nugget watch missing and a gold ring.
We'll canvass the area's pawn shops to see if we can find those items.
Detective Dixon then broaches a very touchy subject with Ken's wife.
Did he have any friends or acquaintances that maybe you didn't approve of? Did he ever leave late at night to go meet people, or?
I know what you're trying to say. And he was not like that. It isn't true.
Wanda tells detectives she put this nagging rumor to bed years ago.
Yes, may I help you?
You're Ken's wife?
Yes, and you are?
I'm someone you should probably know about.
I don't follow.
Ken and I are together.
A gentleman named Tom told the wife that he had been involved romantically with the victim for the past 16 years.
I'm trying to do the right thing. That's why I've come here today. Can I come in and just have a few minutes of your time?
No, you are not.
He told me that once your kids were grown, and they are,
No.
that he was going to leave you for me.
I don't know who you are, but you're lying to me.
Ma'am, I love
Get out!
I
Get
love
off
him.
my property!
Please don't do that.
I'm gonna call the police if you don't leave!
Please don't do that.
Get out!
Wanda confronted her husband when he got home.
Who the hell is Tom?
Tom? I don't know who you're talking about.
The victim denied to the wife that he had been involved with Tom and that he was homosexual.
I can't believe you would even listen to that nonsense.
Well, what am I supposed to think? Who is this man?
He's just an old friend from work that plays jokes on me, that's all. I'm sorry he upset you, honey. I really am. He shouldn't have done that.
Her exact words were that Kenneth said it wasn't true, therefore it wasn't true.
End of story for Wanda, but not for investigators.
This kind of reinforced what we were learning at the beach about the homosexual activity. That is, if we could verify it through Tom.
Detectives meet with Ken's alleged companion the following day.
He promised me that once the kids were grown, he'd leave his wife. Obviously, he never did. After all the years I waited, dude, it broke my heart.
Detectives are now convinced that their victim did indeed harbor a secret life.
This new information changed the entire investigation. They were now able to have a clearer idea of what it was that might have led to Mr. Richardson's death.
We really never know everything about everyone. There's always secrets that we all have, and Mr. Richardson had his own set of secrets.
The thing is, Tom's grief seems genuine, and he doesn't match the sketch of the man the witness saw driving Ken's car 2 nights before he was killed.
Tom took the death very hard of Mr. Richardson. It was quite obvious there was a lot of love for Mr. Richardson.
This leaves detectives back at square one. In October, 6 weeks after the murder, the medical examiner's full report is published.
The autopsy showed us that the trajectory of the arrow was just at a very slight down angle, which would indicate that the arrow was shot fairly close.
Investigators now know for sure that a stone-cold killer aimed his bow point blank at the preacher and sent an arrow straight through his chest.
He was using a twin cam compound bow, just like the kind you would use for hunting. He would have to be inside 25 or 30 yards.
The medical examiner also notes a small defensive wound on Ken's forearms, so even in the darkness on that remote area of beach, detectives believe Ken saw it coming.
No! He might have solicited somebody who's not gay. Exactly. We both know that beach is a hangout for bubbas, so they can drink, fish, and whatever.
Detectives dub it their Bubba theory.
The Bubba theory was that someone that was not gay was propositioned by Mr. Richardson, was offended, and killed him.
But police haven't forgotten their most promising person of interest, Wayne Warner. According to the anonymous tipster, Wayne worked for the employers of both the victim and his wife. He also bears a striking resemblance to the police sketch.
One second. Dixon. Yes, ma'am. Got an address on that? Great. No, thank you. Sounds like we got him.
Turns out, 44-year-old Warner is only 325 miles away, working temp jobs and shuffling between friends and rundown motels in Florida City.
Look, I told you guys, I don't know a Wanda Richardson.
Even though you worked at the same factory as her?
It's a big place. I didn't work there that long.
What about Ken Richardson? Do you remember seeing him at all when you were around the construction site?
No, there's a lot of us working there.
Let me ask you, Wayne, why the concealed weapons permit?
It's just for personal protection.
Ever do any hunting, Wayne?
We started laying on a little bit more pressure, and he said, I know why you're here talking to me, but I didn't do it.
I have a composite sketch here. I'd like for you to take a look at it and tell me who does this bear an amazing resemblance to?
kind of like me?
Not kinda. Looks exactly like you, Wayne.
I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't there.
Wayne Warner insists he was living in Indiana during the time of the preacher's murder and moved down to Florida 2 weeks later. Detectives dig a little further into his alibi and find a glitch. Warner's sister tells police her brother left Indiana August 25th, a day before the murder. And there's more.
We received leads that he also had a light blue station wagon.
Which could be the car seen parked near the victims on the night of the killing. The coincidences are too numerous to ignore. 4 months after the murder, detectives decide to invite Wayne to the station for a dance with the polygraph machine.
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Warner. How are you?
Hi, Detective. What else can I do for you?
Wanna schedule a time you can come in?
Look, Detective, I'd love to help you out, but my lawyer says I shouldn't take any lie detector test.
Would help the investigation if you...
Look, I know you think you have the right guy, but I didn't do it.
He realized he looked like a good suspect. He was starting to get scared that we were going to charge him with the murder.
It's a harsh blow to the investigation. Without forensic evidence to tie Warner to the crime, detectives' only hope is to somehow persuade him to confess.
If he was guilty, we were going to have to prove it a different way.
I believe his lawyer's not going to let him take the polygraph now.
Detectives then receive a new phone tip from the preacher's home state.
Hello? Yes, ma'am.
This time, it's from someone who worked with Wanda Richardson, the victim's wife.
It's a co-worker of Wanda. She says that the marriage to Ken was nothing but a sham, and that people at work think she may have had something to do with the murder.
Sounds like the rumor mill is in full swing at Wanda's job. If it's true, then Wanda wasn't honest about her marriage. Did Ken's
know that no matter what, the person would have to account for what they did, whether it was here or later on.
But things have a way of bubbling up to the surface, even in a grungy swamp. Almost 2 years after the murder of Ken Richardson, police get a call that brings the case back in full force.
Homicide, Detective Dixon. How can I help you? Yes, ma'am. That's terrible.
There was a unrelated case where a 4-year-old girl had been sexually abused and injured.
The mother of the little girl claims her ex-boyfriend, Keith Benefield, is the culprit, and she drops another bombshell. Her ex-boyfriend is also a murderer.
He said that he killed someone.
In what way?
He said he killed a man with his bow and arrow.
An exhaustive 2-year investigation into the savage murder of Ken Richardson has drummed up heaps of dead ends and frustration. But in the summer of 2003, detectives catch the break that changes everything.
Hurt my little girl. He's got a bird for this.
A young woman named Kelly Callahan turns in her boyfriend of 2 years, Keith Benefield, for sexually abusing her 4-year-old daughter.
Keith Benefield was about 30 years old, and he had a pretty checkered past.
A background check on Benefield reveals he was a felon. He was released from prison in Ohio and moved to Florida months before the murder of Ken Richardson. According to Kelly, she and Keith started dating in September of 2001, and soon after he confessed to taking a man's life.
He said he killed a man with his bow and arrow.
Why didn't you tell the police about this right away?
He threatened to kill anyone who ratted him out.
She gave us so much information, it sounded really good that this might be our guy.
So how did this felon know Ken Richardson? And why would he put an arrow through his chest? 1 month later, detectives sit down with Keith Benefield, already in custody on the child molestation charge.
You, know why we're here?
No.
Ever been to Fort Island Gulf Beach?
Not that I can recall. A lot of people do some hunting out there. What's that got to do with me? Do you hunt, Keith? No. You ever use a bow?
There's a lot of deer out there, Keith.
That's what you got, huh?
Like hounds on the scent of a varmint, investigators don't let up.
Let me see your hands. Those 2 fingers have a major callus buildup. Appears to me that you're right-handed. What do you think?
Oh, I'm pretty sure those are the 2 fingers you use on the drawstring for a bow.
Boy, you two really make a pair, don't you?
The suspect doesn't have an alibi for the night that Ken Richardson was struck down with an arrow. If Keith won't talk, police will talk to everyone he knows.
Keith denied shooting bows, but we found several people that told us about not only a compound bow that he owned, but about how he would shoot almost daily.
Turns out Keith is an expert marksman with a bow.
You cannot possibly be that good.
How much you want to bet?
Oh, really?
I tell you what, I hit that bullseye. Not only are you buying me a case of beer, but you're also giving me a kiss.
Okay, I think I'll take you up on that offer.
All right.
Oh my God, I cannot believe you just did that.
I warned you.
We measured that distance at 90 feet. He was very skilled.
So skilled, in fact, that for Keith, piercing the chest of a victim from 25 to 30 feet away would have been child's play. Detectives search the woods behind Keith's home back in Florida and find it littered with spent arrows.
You know, that one looks exactly like the one we found at the beach.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for a guy who said he never shot a bow before, sure are a lot of arrows around here.
They were a match. The arrows were consistent with the arrow that we found with the victim.
The bow used to cut down Ken Richardson was not in Keith's possession, but that didn't stop detectives from being able to tie him to the deadly arrow itself.
Let's gather these up.
Keith asked his stepbrother on 2 different occasions to hold a bow for him because he had done something really, really bad. The brother refused, did not want to get involved.
According to his ex-girlfriend, Keith eventually sold that bow for $20.
Thank you. Yes, sir. That was our buyer. He doesn't have the bow anymore, but he is willing to testify that Keith sold it to him back in '01.
And there's more good news. Detectives find Keith's blue car at a junkyard. The previous owner is none other than Keith Benefield's mother. But it is a connection to the victim's missing gold watch that is the most damning.
Miss Callahan.
Oh, detective.
Good to see you again.
Likewise.
Kelly told us about a time when they were hard up for money, and Keith gave her a gold nugget watch to pawn.
Can you spot the watch that your boyfriend Keith had you pawn?
That one. That's it.
This one, you're sure?
That's the one.
The things that really tied Keith Benefield to this case were the matching arrows that were found on his property, the fact that he had the gold watch pawned, that he drove a blue car. In my opinion, all those things add up to a killer.
Benefield refuses to confess, but detectives have the killer's earlier confession to his girlfriend that'll stand up in court.
What did you guys do?
Kelly told us that Keith was out at the beach fishing.
What kind of fish you plan on catching this time of year?
Oh, I'm not really sure. I'm just gonna take my chances, see what hits out there.
A gentleman approached him.
Well, I'll go down there with you.
Hey, man, don't touch me, all right? Seriously.
You know, some people come down here for some excitement, you know what I mean?
What are you doing?
And some people come down here to enjoy themselves.
You touched me for the last time. You messed up now, buddy.
He got propositioned by Mr. Richardson on several occasions, and he finally had enough.
I got something for you, old man.
Oh, no, no, listen, I was only kidding. No, no, please, don't. Please don't, no!
Investigators will never truly know how or why the killing happened.
The final account of the murder is the murderer's account. It's the only account we truly have.
I don't know that I would believe anything that he said about what happened because he's already known to be a criminal.
To avoid the death penalty, Keith Benefield pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 30 years.
It felt very good when it was finished. Can't hurt anybody else.
It was a long case for everyone involved. It provided a big sense of closure for the community in general.
For Ken Richardson's family, the pain and loss will never heal, but they are comforted by their faith.
Even in the scariest moment, I know my dad wouldn't have been alone. God was still there.
Washington can look like a place built to hide things. The sky hangs low. The air smells of wet earth and cedar, and the roads running through the Seattle-Tacoma corridor seem to stretch between worlds that do not quite touch each other. On one side, there are neighborhoods, factories, diners, truck stops, schoolyards, and the ordinary machinery of American life. On the other, there are ditches full of rainwater, tree lines that swallow sound, embankments under bridges, patches of brush beside highways, and the soft, indifferent geography of the Pacific Northwest, where mud, river water, and darkness can take the shape from a body and hold it for a long time. That is one reason the story of Gary Ridgway feels so cold even now. It does not begin in a mansion, in a basement fitted for horror, or in a world already marked by spectacle. It begins in the margins of a working landscape, in the damp spaces beside roads, in motels with flickering signs, in parking lots where engines idle too long, and in the exhausted glow of a strip where girls and young women waited under streetlights because they needed money, because they had nowhere else to go, because they were too young to have become this tired and already too tired to imagine a clean way out. The Green River Killer was not frightening because he shattered the world in one dramatic night. He was frightening because he settled into it. He used what was already there, the hunger, the cold, the addiction, the shame, the indifference, the way certain women could go missing and the world would first ask what they had done wrong before asking who had done something to them. That is the true hook of this case. Not only that Gary Ridgway killed, and killed many times, and kept killing for years, it is that he learned how to move through a landscape where some disappearances made less noise, where a girl could vanish from the Pacific Highway South Strip and for a while still be treated as if she had only slipped farther into the same hard life everyone already expected from her. He did not invent that cruelty. He climbed inside it and wore it like camouflage. If you want to enter this story, you have to imagine a night in the Seattle area in the early 1980s. The air is damp enough to settle into clothing. Neon reflects off puddles and broken patches of color. Cars ease along the road. Slow. Watch. Move again. A girl stands with her arms folded against the cold. She might be 15, 16. Maybe older. Maybe she looks older because survival has a way of pulling the softness out of a face before it's time. She has makeup on, maybe too much. Maybe smudged at the edges, a cheap jacket. Tired shoes, a practiced expression. She is trying to look alert without looking afraid. She is trying to measure men in the seconds it takes a vehicle to slow beside her. Is he drunk? Violent. Lonely. Broke. Mean. Young. Old. Jittery. Dangerous in the usual way, or dangerous in the final way. The problem is that in that world, those distinctions can collapse without warning. A man can look like every other client right up until the moment he becomes the last person you ever see. That is where Ridgway lived, in that tiny space between routine danger and irreversible disappearance. He was not a howling madman announcing himself to the world. He was a man in a vehicle. A man who knew how to seem ordinary long enough. A man who could speak softly. Make an offer. Ask a question. Gesture to the passenger seat, and let the rest of the world keep moving as if nothing important were happening. There are serial killers whose names attach to spectacle, letters, symbols, taunts, masks, dramatic manhunts. Ridgway belongs to another category, more poisonous, because it is so much easier to imagine living beside it. He was a worker. He had a routine. He could go from his job to the roads and back again. He could put on a face that did not demand explanation. And while that face moved through ordinary life, girls and women were vanishing into the wet dark around Seattle and Tacoma. That contrast is what makes the case so devastating. A region known for rain and rivers and evergreens became, for years, a place where vulnerable women were being fed into silence by someone who understood just how little immediate protection stood between them and a stranger with a car. The river itself matters, of course. The Green River was not the only site connected to the murders, but its name became the vessel that carried the whole nightmare into public memory. Rivers and stories often suggest movement, cleansing, a path through the landscape. Here the river became something else. It became a witness that kept giving back pieces of the truth too slowly. Bodies found near it or associated with the same terrain transformed an ordinary natural feature into a symbol of accumulation, of neglect, of a city learning too late that the missing girls were not simply drifting away one by one. The water did not create the crimes, but it gave them an image the country could not forget. And yet even that image can mislead, because it risks making the case sound almost mythic, when in fact its deepest horror lies in its social reality. Most of the women Ridgway targeted were not protected by wealth, by stable homes, by institutions that moved quickly on their behalf. Many were runaways, sex workers, young women already living close to addiction, violence, or homelessness. They were not living outside society. They were living in the exact places where society had decided to thin out its compassion. That is why this story hurts in a way beyond the body count. It asks not only how one man could become such a predator, but how a region could leave so many women standing so exposed in the first place. The answer is not simple, and that is part of what gives the case its endurance. It is not only the story of a killer, it is the story of a hierarchy of grief. The daughter of a stable suburban family goes missing and panic organizes itself quickly. The runaway, the girl on the strip, the woman with a record, the sex worker, the addict. They disappear into a slower kind of alarm. Families still ache. Of course, mothers still stop sleeping. Sisters still wait at windows. Friends still whisper about the last time they saw her. But public urgency can lag behind private terror, and a predator can do monstrous things inside that lag. Gary Ridgway understood that in the most brutal possible way. Maybe he never put it into sophisticated words, but his actions show the knowledge plainly. He chose women whose lives had already been pushed to the edge. He chose women who were expected to take risks, expected to disappear for a night or two, expected to survive men who frightened them. He chose women whom the world had trained itself to judge before fully mourning. That knowledge, that instinct for where human value is least loudly defended, is part of what makes him so chilling. To think of him only as a killer is not enough. He was also an opportunist of social weakness. He killed where the system had already thinned out the guardrails. There is another reason the case enters the body so deeply. It forces you to imagine repetition in a place where everything else looks ordinary. Another car slowing, another girl stepping closer, another negotiation through a cracked window, another ride. Another family eventually realizing this is not one of the usual disappearances. Another detective pinning up another photograph. Another search through underbrush, riverbanks, and roadside brush. Another body recovered where no one should have been left. The Green River Killer did not simply create a scene of horror, he created a rhythm of it. A dreadful routine of absence that stretched across years. The roads kept filling with traffic. The bars kept serving drinks, the motels kept taking cash. The factories kept changing shifts, Seattle and Tacoma kept living. And meanwhile, mothers were making calls, police were sorting reports. And a man with a plain face kept driving through the same weather as everyone else, while carrying inside him a private permission to kill. That permission is worth sitting with, because it tells us something essential about the psychology of this case. Ridgway did not kill in a burst that destroyed his ability to function. He killed and then went on. He folded murder into daily life. He could return to work, to conversation, to ordinary errands. That is one of the ugliest qualities a serial killer can have. Not theatrical madness, but administrative calm. The ability to make room for death in the same life that also makes room for paychecks and traffic. It is that calm which makes the whole story feel infected from the beginning. A man can be standing in line at a store, nodding to someone, carrying his lunch, and already have a map in his head of where a body can be left. Once you realize that, the case stops being just a catalog of brutality and becomes something more invasive. It becomes a story about how normal a predator can look when the people he hunts are those the world watches least carefully. If there is one image that should open this case, it is not yet the courtroom or the DNA or the headlines. It is a wet roadside under a yellow streetlight. A teenage girl waiting with her shoulders drawn in against the cold. A car slowing down. A man at the wheel who does not look remarkable enough to become history. A brief exchange. The passenger door opening, and then the whole machinery of the case already turning. A family soon to worry. A city soon to count another missing girl. A police department slowly beginning to realize that the roads and riverbanks of King County are returning the same terrible message again and again. That is the true beginning of the Green River story. Not one dramatic strike, but the discovery that evil had learned to move quietly through the exact places where fear was already part of a woman's nightly routine. And once it learned that, it kept feeding on the same wounded corner of the world for years. That is why this case does not simply chill. It accuses a culture that can see girls standing in danger and still somehow file them under background scenery. It accuses the habits of thought that make some mothers feel they must first prove their daughters were worth searching for. It accuses the lazy comfort of people who imagine that the women on the strip chose everything that happened to them, as if desperation were a free and glamorous act. Ridgway moved inside those accusations before anyone had the courage to say them aloud. He was not some sorcerer of concealment. He was a man protected by the world's reluctance to look straight at vulnerable women until the evidence became impossible to ignore. There is a special kind of cruelty in that. It means the killer was not simply stronger than his victims. He was reinforced by every prejudice already hanging over them. By every eye that slid past, by every officer, citizen, customer, or passerby who had learned to see a teenage runaway or a sex worker as a type before seeing her as a person. And because of that, when bodies began to appear, the discovery did not only horrify, it humiliated. It forced the region to ask itself how many of these girls had been living inside plain view all along. Visible at the edge of the road and invisible in the center of concern. The answer was too many. Much too many. The Green River Killer became infamous because the numbers were staggering. But numbers are only the skeleton of the story. The flesh of it is this. A wet night. A girl bargaining with risk because she has done it before. A man who understands exactly how that familiarity dulls alarm, and a city not yet ready to grasp that what looks like one more dangerous encounter is actually part of a pattern feeding on its own blind spots. That pattern is what turned the case into one of the darkest in American history. It was not just murder. It was murder made efficient by the unequal distribution of sympathy, and that makes every later revelation feel heavier. When the FBI eventually linked DNA to one of the victims and Ridgway was arrested in 2001, the country saw a killer finally named. But buried inside that moment was another truth. The man had been living inside ordinary time for 2 decades, while girls and women kept vanishing from the same weather-beaten margins. He had been eating dinner, going to work, driving through the rain, making himself look as ordinary as any other man in line at a cashier. While families lost daughters into a silence that took too long to become public emergency, that is the atmosphere this first part must leave behind. Not just terror, but shame. Not just a murderer, but a murderer who found shelter in the moral fog around vulnerable women. The Pacific Northwest gave him rain, brush, riverbanks, and long roads. Society gave him something far worse, the knowledge that some missing girls would not be treated as if the ground itself should open immediately to give them back. That knowledge became his weapon long before DNA, long before confessions. Long before the name Gary Ridgway was fixed to the case, it was there in the cold under the streetlights. In the pauses between one disappearance and the next, in the weary acceptance on the faces of girls who knew every car might be trouble, but still had to lean toward the window and ask how much. Somewhere in that exchange, the whole future of the case was already present. The river, the woods, the files, the grief, the years, the number that would never feel final. That is how the Green River story begins, not with the killer's name, but with the world failing to hear soon enough the sound made when vulnerable women start disappearing into the rain. And even then, fear would not arrive once, it would seep in. One recovered body, one unfinished call home. One mother sitting through dawn, one detective pinning another photograph. One more stretch of muddy ground refusing to stay only landscape by the time the region understood it was living with a serial killer. The killer had already taught himself how to disappear inside weather. The setting and background of the Green River case cannot be understood as the story of one man alone. Because Gary Ridgway did not create the world that made his crimes possible. He entered a world already full of fractures and learned, with a patience that now feels almost inhuman, exactly where those fractures were widest. In the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the Seattle-Tacoma corridor was a place of movement, industry, rain, and restless edges. It was the kind of region where truck routes, airport traffic, industrial roads, cheap motels, suburban houses, bars, and stretches of anonymous highway all lay close enough together that a person could cross from ordinary family life into the margins of survival in less than an hour. Boeing shifts ended, cars rolled south. Men stopped for coffee, beer, sex, or nothing at all. Girls stood in wet parking lots or along roadsides waiting for money that might buy one more night indoors, one more meal, one more dose, one more temporary escape from whatever had already broken behind them. That is the setting, not a dramatic underworld hidden beneath the city, but a visible edge the city had learned to treat as background. Pacific Highway South, especially the stretch people called the Strip, became one of the most significant stages in this story. It was not glamorous vice, it was tired vice. Neon signs buzzing in the damp, motels with thin curtains and tired mattresses, fast food wrappers blowing against curbs, cars slowing, stopping, idling, moving on, men scanning faces, girls scanning plates, eyes, hands, shoes. The first 3 words out of a mouth, if you stood there long enough, you could feel how business and danger had fused into the same rhythm. Nothing in that environment was built to protect the women inside it. It was built to use them and move on. Ridgway understood that long before the public understood him. He did not have to invent vulnerability, he only had to find it. Recognize how cheaply it was priced by the world around him, and step into the machinery already waiting. Washington itself helped form the atmosphere of the crimes. The state can look open and breathable from a distance. all evergreen ridges, gray skies, long rivers, slopes of wet brush, and roads that seem to vanish into timber and mist. But for a killer, that beauty carries another function. A riverbank is not only scenery. A ravine is not only landscape under a low sky. A patch of brush beside a road can become a place where a body disappears from the living world with frightening ease. The Green River and the surrounding wooded areas did not kill anyone, but they gave the killer space, concealment, delay. They made time work on his behalf. Rain softened edges, mud swallowed traces. Water and wildlife altered the dead. Searchers had to move through terrain that was physically punishing and emotionally numbing, as if the region itself were conspiring to blur one missing girl into the next. In another kind of case, the killer's setting is a basement, a house, a room with a single center. Here the setting is dispersed. A pickup point on the strip, a car moving through dark roads, a secluded spot, a dump site near a river or under brush, a suburban home where the man returns afterward and becomes, once again, another worker in another neighborhood. That geographical spread matters because it mirrors the moral spread of the case. The crime was not contained in one chamber. It was smeared across a whole region that had learned how not to look too closely at certain women. To understand the background, you also have to understand the women he targeted. Not yet as individuals, but as a social reality. Many were teenagers or very young women. Many had run from homes that were violent, unstable, or unbearable. Many were already living in the grip of addiction or on the threshold of it. Some were mothers. Some were sleeping in motels, cars, friends' apartments, or nowhere reliable at all. Their danger began long before Ridgway entered their lives. They were moving through a society that already sorted people by worth. A runaway girl could disappear for hours or days before anyone with power treated it as an emergency. A sex worker could be beaten, threatened, humiliated, and still return to the same road the next night because survival required returning. A young woman with a record or a drug problem could become, in the eyes of institutions, less a daughter in danger than a problem in motion. That was the background music of the case, and it never stopped playing. It is impossible to tell this story honestly without hearing that music. Ridgway's crimes did not float above class, race, and gender. They were embedded in them. He targeted women whose lives the wider culture had already pushed toward the shoulder of the road. He was not merely preying on vulnerability in the abstract. He was exploiting a hierarchy of protection. A missing suburban honor student and a missing teenage sex worker did not trigger the same response. That imbalance was one of his greatest weapons. If the first part of the story is about fear moving through the rain, the second part is about the world that taught that fear where to settle. Gary Ridgway himself emerged from a background that, on the surface, looked ordinary enough to protect him for years. He was not a flamboyant outcast. He was not a wild-eyed drifter without routine. He was, in the broad American sense, painfully average. He held a job. He married. He moved through the same kinds of neighborhoods, stores, roads, and workplaces as thousands of other men. That ordinariness is not a minor detail. It is one of the darkest elements in the entire case, because it meant that the predator did not announce himself with visible theatricality. He could disappear into traffic. He could punch a clock. He could speak with the clumsy bluntness of an ordinary working man. He could be remembered, if noticed at all, as awkward, dull, maybe crude, maybe somewhat strange, but not spectacular enough to become a immediate nightmare. That is one reason this case lasted so long. The image people often want from a monster is an image that reassures them, someone obviously deranged, someone unforgettable, someone already set apart from the social body. Ridgway did not offer that comfort. He offered the opposite. The possibility that a man could carry years of murder inside a life that still looked, from outside, usable, his childhood and early life, as later described, contained familiar elements from the biographies of violent men. Tension in the family, a difficult emotional environment. A distorted relationship with women and sexuality, early compulsive behavior. Private fantasies growing darker as he aged, but what is striking is not how exceptional these elements were. It is how unexceptional they could seem when scattered across time. A troubled boy. A resentful young man, someone with sexual confusion. Shame, anger, and a deep need to dominate. America has produced many such men without producing Gary Ridgway. What transformed him was not one single childhood wound that can be pointed to like a switch. It was the way those wounds combined with opportunity, with misogyny, with an ability to compartmentalize, and with a world that placed his victims exactly where his impulses could operate with maximum impunity. He appears, in other words, not as a supernatural eruption of evil, but as a particularly terrible convergence of inner corrosion and outer advantage. His relationship to women seems crucial here. Ridgway did not move through the world as a man overwhelmed by grand philosophical delusions or flamboyant fantasies about fame. His violence was colder and, in some ways, more domestic. He sought access. He wanted compliance. He wanted women under his control, and when control was threatened or no longer satisfying in life, death became an extension of his power. The women he targeted were often those the world already described in language of contamination: damaged, used, out there, asking for it, gone bad. Those are the kinds of phrases societies invent to reduce empathy. Ridgway seems to have internalized exactly that reduction. He could approach these women not as full human presences, but as available surfaces for his own need to dominate and erase. That is what makes the case feel so much like an extension of social violence, rather than a break from it. He took ideas already circulating in the culture about which women mattered less and translated them into murder. The Pacific Northwest in the 1980s was also a place where mobility itself shaped the atmosphere. Men in cars. Men moving between work sites, bars, highway exits, and strip malls. Men who could disappear into a stream of similar men. That should not be overlooked. The car is central to the background of the case. It is privacy, mobility, anonymity, and authority all at once for the women on the strip. The car was a gamble repeated over and over. It might contain an ordinary John, a drunk, a violent man, a decent tip, a threat, a beating, a bad memory, a survivable encounter, or death. Every time a door opened, a calculation happened. The setting taught them to calculate fast, but no one can calculate perfectly every night forever. Especially not when they are cold, exhausted, hungry, desperate, intoxicated, or simply trying to make enough money to get through the next day. Ridgway's background as a driver through that world gave him a method that looked almost identical to the transactions around him. That was part of his genius. If the word can be used at all in such a context, he hid inside routine. He did not need to lure victims into some bizarre fantasy. He only needed to resemble what they already expected long enough. A man pulls over, a window comes down. A conversation starts, the car door opens. That was all the doorway he needed. The police background of the region is another part of the setting. And another source of bitterness. Law enforcement in King County was dealing with disappearances, street crime, drugs, prostitution, and the ordinary pressures of a growing metropolitan region. Detectives and patrol officers were not operating in a vacuum, but they were operating inside a system that reflected the same uneven priorities as the culture around it. Cases involving young, poor, addicted, or sexually exploited women did not always rise instantly to the level of concentrated crisis. This does not mean no one cared. Many did. Families cared desperately. Some detectives cared with a force that nearly consumed them. But institutions care unevenly, and that unevenness creates delay. Delay is oxygen for a serial killer. Each absence that did not immediately trigger a full-force response taught Ridgway something. Each night the strip kept operating as usual taught him something. Each body that could be concealed long enough to become another painful file rather than an immediate public explosion taught him something. The setting and background of the Green River case are therefore inseparable from the concept of delay. Delay in how danger is named. Delay in how missing women are prioritized. Delay in how fragmented cases are unified into a pattern. Delay in how one ordinary man can remain ordinary in the eyes of the world while carrying an unimaginable private history, and all of that delay collected in the same wet geography. Under the same gray skies, along the same roads. There is also the emotional setting, the weather inside the lives of the women before they vanished. Many were already living in emergency. That matters, because it means the killer entered stories that were already unstable. He did not need to create the first rupture. He only needed to exploit the fact that life had already ruptured elsewhere. At home, in childhood, in a foster system, in an abusive relationship, in the economy, in addiction. The women on the strip were not waiting there because they had exhausted every safe option and somehow preferred danger. They were there because danger had become part of the price of staying alive. That is one of the hardest truths in the whole case. The setting is not only external weather and roads, it is also interior weather, fatigue, hunger, fear normalized into routine, hope reduced to short horizons. That background made every encounter with a man like Ridgway more loaded and more tragic. If this part must leave one image behind, it should be wider than the killer and wider than the river. It should be the whole corridor between Seattle and Tacoma under a low sky, highways slick with rain, trucks moving, diners open late, motels buzzing, girls in thin jackets under sodium lights, detectives beginning to pin photos to boards, mothers making calls. And somewhere among all that movement, a man so ordinary he might be overlooked in a grocery line, driving the same roads over and over, learning more each time about how little noise the world made when certain women vanished. That is the background. Not a single dark room, but an entire social landscape trained not to hear certain cries at full volume. And in that lowered volume, Gary Ridgway found the one thing every serial killer needs more than intelligence: time. Every culture teaches itself what to notice. The Green River story begins in a place that had already decided, far too often, not to notice enough, and that decision hung in the air long before anyone knew his name. It was in the quick judgment passed on girls walking the strip, in the weariness of families who had already been through too many disappearances and returns, in the distrust with which sex workers were viewed, in the way whole neighborhoods learned to let the highway carry danger elsewhere, so ordinary life could keep pretending it was untouched. Ridgway did not tear open a safe world. He learned how to hunt in one that had already left part of itself outside in the rain. That is the real setting of the case, and without it, nothing else about him makes full sense. The victim's story in the case of Gary Ridgway is the hardest part to tell, honestly, because the scale of the murders tempts people to speak in numbers, and numbers are the enemy of mourning. A number can shock. A number can fill a headline. A number can make a killer look vast and a case look historic, but a number cannot laugh, cannot run away from home with a backpack and a bad plan, cannot call a sister collect from a payphone, cannot promise a child that things will get better, cannot stand under a wet streetlight in a denim jacket pretending not to be afraid. The Green River case is often remembered as a mountain of victims, a terrible arithmetic of death stretching across years. What must not be forgotten is that every one of those victims entered the story as a person long before she became evidence. She had a name, a voice, a smell on her clothes, a private rhythm of hope and exhaustion, a way of brushing hair out of her face, a reason she left the house that day, or a reason she no longer had a house to leave. Before the river, before the woods, before the files and press conferences and courtrooms, there were girls and women trying, failing, surviving, relapsing, laughing, lying, negotiating, and making one more decision inside lives that were already too difficult. That is where this part has to begin. Not in the killer's list of bodies, but in the fragile, ordinary humanity of the women he chose. Many of Ridgway's victims were painfully young. Some were still teenagers, standing at the edge of adulthood with none of the protection adulthood is supposed to bring. That youth matters in a particular way here, because the public often hears that a victim was a runaway, a sex worker, an addict, or someone already living in chaos, and imagines a kind of hardness that makes suffering look less shocking. But youth does not disappear because life turns rough. A 16-year-old on a dangerous highway is still 16. A girl who has slept in motels, cars, or strangers' apartments is still someone whose body and mind are forming under pressure they were never meant to carry. The Green River victims were not women who stepped neatly into a doomed category. Many of them were children in all the ways that count most, still learning what love was, still hoping to be rescued by a boyfriend, a mother, a social worker, a job, a lucky break, a bus ticket, a clean week, a room of their own. Some had babies. Some were pregnant. Some had already learned how to smile while frightened because fear was no longer an event in their lives, but part of the wallpaper. That does not make them less innocent. It makes the violence done to them even more obscene. What is especially devastating about the victim's story in this case is that many of these women were already carrying histories of injury before Ridgway ever saw them. Abuse at home, foster care, poverty, sexual assault, drugs used first as relief and later as cage. Men who had already taught them that their bodies were currency. A girl does not usually arrive on Pacific Highway South by taking one wrong turn. She arrives through years of pressure, abandonment, coercion, hunger, loneliness, and the slow erosion of choices. So when people say Ridgway targeted vulnerable women, the phrase can sound too abstract, almost clinical. In reality, it means he hunted among those whom the world had already failed several times over. He selected women who were visible and unseen at the same time, standing under neon every night in plain sight, and yet invisible to the deeper protections that shield others. He did not create their vulnerability. He inserted himself into it. That is one reason the grief in this case feels so bitter. Each victim was not only murdered, she was betrayed by a society that had been watching her stand in danger long before the killer arrived. It is important to remember that many of these women were loved, even when their lives looked chaotic from the outside. Some had mothers who never stopped searching. Some had fathers who held photographs until the corners softened. Some had sisters who remembered the exact way they laughed when they were little, before men, drugs, and roads full of headlights entered the story. Some had children who grew up with a blank place where a mother should have been. That blank place is part of the victim's story, too. A child asking where she is, a family still setting a place in the mind long after the body is gone. A grandmother becoming mother all over again because a daughter never came back. In cases like this, the public often fixates on the mystery of the killer and forgets the long domestic aftermath. The kitchen tables where families waited, the birthdays that became memorials, the Christmases where no one said the name at first because saying it made the absence too sharp. The Green River murders created not only corpses in the woods, but years of suspended family life. Grief here did not enter as one clean blow. For many, it arrived as waiting through one night, then another, then a week, then a season, then the call, or no call, or the news that a body had been found and might be hers, or the worst possibility that nothing had been found and there would be no ending at all. Take the lives behind the broad categories and the case becomes almost unbearable. A teenage girl who liked to draw hearts in the margins of paper, a young mother who could make her child laugh even after a day gone bad, a runaway who swore she would never go back home and still secretly wanted someone to come get her, a woman who had been called difficult all her life but still gave away cigarettes to girls younger than herself on the strip, Another who carried a stuffed animal in a bag because some part of childhood had not fully died. Another who knew all the cheap diners open after midnight and how to warm her hands on a coffee cup while pretending she still had somewhere to be in the morning. This is the texture that numbers erase. The victims were not interchangeable. Though the killer treated them that way, they had different dreams, different families, different thresholds for fear, different ideas about what counted as escape. Some wanted to save enough money for an apartment. Some wanted to get clean. Some wanted to leave the state. Some only wanted to survive the week. Their ambitions may have been humble, bruised, or inconsistent, but they were still ambitions. Every one of them had a future before Ridgway converted it into a file. The street itself also shaped their humanity in ways people often overlook. Women on the strip learned to read men quickly, to scan headlights, license plates, body language, tone. They learned which clients might hurt them, which might simply use them, which might pay and leave, which might refuse to pay, which might drive too far, which might be undercover, which might be bluffing. That kind of intelligence does not show up well in official summaries. But it mattered. These women were not naive in the simple sense. Many were highly alert. They had survived men before. They had survived beatings, bad dates, forced sex, robberies, pimps, dealers, raids, and cold. What makes the case so haunting is that even this hard-won street intelligence was not enough against a man who understood exactly how to appear ordinary long enough. Their experience had taught them to survive danger. It could not always teach them to recognize the final kind of danger in time. That is part of the tragedy. They were not weak. They were outmatched by a system and by a predator who used that system's blind spots as part of his method. There is also the question of dignity after death. Serial murder tends to strip victims twice. Once through violence and again through the way history condenses them. In the Green River case, that second stripping is especially cruel because so many victims have been remembered first through the lens of the life they were living at the time of disappearance. Runaway, prostitute, addict, troubled girl. But none of those words capture the full person. They describe a crisis, not a soul. They mark a condition, not a character. A woman could be prostituting herself and still be a devoted mother in the few hours she was with her child. She could be using drugs and still have a sharp wit, a protective instinct, an older sister's tenderness, a favorite song, a fierce desire not to die. To tell the victim's story properly means refusing to let the most painful chapter of a life become the whole book. Ridgway benefited from a culture willing to reduce these women to the worst thing about their circumstances. The least we can do in telling the story is refuse to reduce them again. The recovered bodies, when they were found, changed families forever. But even then, they did not always restore personhood in the public eye. A set of remains in brushland near a river can sound like evidence before it sounds like a daughter. Yet every recovery was somebody's child, returning in the most terrible form. Detectives may have worked with maps, dental charts, clothing fragments, and timelines, but mothers and sisters worked with memory. That bracelet looks like hers. She had a gap in her teeth. She wore that color often. She hated the cold. She would never have left without calling, unless something was wrong. Those are not sentimental details. They are the bridge between the official victim and the living person. In a case so large, that bridge matters because otherwise the dead become terrain. One more set of remains near the river. One more name linked to the series. But every set of remains once had a heartbeat, a voice saying she would be right back. A body tired from standing too long under wet streetlights, a childhood nickname known only inside the family. That is what the victim's story must hold on to. Perhaps the most painful truth of all is that many of the Green River victims were still trying. Even in chaos, they were trying. Trying to get through the night, trying to get enough money, trying to keep away from one man and closer to another, trying to stay alive in a world that had made survival look ugly. Some had plans for rehab. Some were patching things up with family. Some were trying to leave prostitution. Some had recently come back home and then slipped away again. Human life in the margins is not static. It is movement. Relapse, return, resistance, collapse. In one more attempt, Ridgway intercepted that movement. He did not kill symbols. He killed unfinished attempts at recovery, reunion, freedom, and adulthood. He killed women in the middle of trying. That is why the victim's story in the Green River case should leave behind not only sorrow, but anger. Anger at the killer, obviously, but also at the conditions that made him effective. A society that looked at many of these girls and women and saw danger before it saw personhood, vice before desperation, nuisance before grief, made it easier for him to go on. The victims carried the weight of that judgment even in death. Families had to fight not only for justice, but for respect. For the simple recognition that the women who vanished into the Seattle-Tacoma rain were fully human, no matter what roads they had been forced onto. And they were, every single one. Not perfect, not tidy. Not easily packaged into innocence that made the public comfortable, but human in the deepest and most painful sense. Complicated, damaged, striving, loving, frightened, funny, reckless, maternal, lonely, alive. The number 48 cannot tell that truth. It can only hint at the size of the theft. So the only honest way to close this part is to bring them back above the category that trapped them. Not just sex workers. Not just runaways. Not just vulnerable women. Girls who should have outgrown the strip and never got the chance. Mothers whose children inherited silence instead of goodbye. Daughters whose families kept hoping through one more night, then one more week, then one more year. Friends who could still picture them leaning against a car, rolling their eyes, laughing into the cold. Human beings who deserved the full weight of alarm the first time they vanished, not after the river and the woods had already begun to speak for them. That is the victim's story here, a story of interrupted lives. Yes, but also of lives that were larger than the danger surrounding them. And if this case still hurts, it is because the world was forced, too late, to realize that the women standing at the edge of the road had been standing at the center of human value all along. There is another image that belongs to them and should not be lost beneath the scale of the case. It is not the image of the search party or the riverbank or the taped-off brush. It is the image of ordinary waiting before fear has a name. A mother smoking by a kitchen window after midnight. A friend standing outside a convenience store thinking she may still show up in the next car. A child asleep in another room. Too young to understand that absence can become permanent before morning. A sister hearing the phone ring and feeling her chest tighten before she even lifts the receiver. These moments are small, domestic, private, but they are where the real weight of the murders settled. The killer destroyed bodies in hidden places, yet the damage spread into bedrooms, kitchens, bus stops, foster homes, shelters, and cheap apartments all over the region. It spread through photographs kept in wallets, through birthdays no one wanted to celebrate loudly, through names spoken more softly each year because speaking them hurt. When we say the Green River Killer targeted vulnerable women, we should hear the full human sentence underneath it. He targeted girls and women who still had favorite foods, old injuries, nervous habits, private jokes, people they missed, people who missed them, and fragile plans for tomorrow. He targeted women whose lives had been made harder by poverty and violence, but whose humanity remained complete. That is why remembering them matters. It is not a gesture, it is a correction to the logic of the crime itself. Because the killer treated them as if no one would insist on the fullness of their lives after they were gone. The incident in the Green River case did not begin with a scream in a locked house or the sound of glass breaking in the middle of the night. It began with a car slowing along Pacific Highway South, with tires hissing over wet pavement. with the driver leaning slightly toward the passenger side window to look at a girl standing under a sodium streetlight, trying not to shiver too visibly. That is what makes this part of the story so unnerving. The violence arrived disguised as routine. Another client. Another negotiation. Another few dollars against the cold. In the world these women were forced to inhabit, danger already existed in nearly every encounter. But it was usually danger with a familiar grammar, a man who wanted more than he would pay for, a man who might hit, insult, threaten, or refuse to let a woman out where she asked. Ridgway learned to hide his final intention inside that ordinary field of risk. He did not need to appear extraordinary. He needed only to appear survivable long enough. The door opens. A woman gets in. A life changes direction. Everything after that depends on how quickly she realizes this is no longer one more bad date for money, but the last ride of her life. Imagine the inside of the vehicle. The heater may be on too high or not at all. There may be the smell of cigarettes, wet fabric, old fast food, machine oil from work clothes, that bland masculine odor of a car used every day and noticed by no one. He asks where she wants to go, or names a price, or keeps his voice low and practical. She watches his hands. She watches the road. She tries to decide whether the silence is normal or wrong. That calculation is one of the cruelest parts of the incident because these women were not naive. Many of them had spent enough time on the strip to read small signs fast. They knew the difference between a nervous first-timer and a mean drunk, between a lonely man and a violent one, between someone looking for sex and someone looking for trouble. But Ridgway lived in the narrow strip between suspicion and certainty. He looked like a working man. He spoke like one. He knew how to delay alarm. The incident then begins in that delay. In the extra minute, a victim gives the situation because she still believes the danger might remain within the range of what she can handle. Once the car pulls away from the strip, the city begins to thin. Neon gives way to darker roads, wider shoulders, industrial lots, service roads, quiet embankments, places where nobody is listening for a woman's voice. The further the car goes, the more the transaction changes, meaning money becomes less important than distance. The woman may feel the wrongness before she can name it, a turn she did not expect, a road too empty, a direction that carries them away from motels and back lots toward places where the only witness will be the weather. Sometimes she may have objected, sometimes she may have tried to sound casual, asking where they were going, saying this was far enough, telling him to stop, telling him she wanted to get out. Those small assertions matter because they reveal that the incident was not merely physical, it was a struggle over reality itself. She is still trying to treat him like a customer bound by rules. He has already moved beyond rules. In that mismatch lies the first terrible crack. He no longer sees a woman negotiating terms. He sees someone he intends to overpower, and every mile of road gives him more control. The incident turns on confinement. In many murders, space is vast and escape seems theoretically possible even if practically doomed. Here the first cage is the car. The doors, the locks, the close air, the movement that makes jumping out more dangerous and hesitation more likely. The body of the victim is contained in a box controlled by another body. There is no clean avenue of flight. Only choices that worsen quickly, and because the interaction began as a transaction, the mind of the victim may still be trying to pull the encounter back into a manageable shape. He is just strange. He is just going too far. He will stop if I insist. He will stop if I threaten to scream. He will stop if I mention the police. But the incident with Ridgway became truly lethal the moment those possibilities stopped meaning anything to him. He did not need an argument. He did not need a provocation. He needed a secluded place in a human being whose life had already been brought close enough to the edge that her disappearance could slip. For a little while, into the weather. Once he had that, the next step was brutally intimate. Ridgway's violence was not distant. It was not the violence of a man who wants clean separation from what he does. It was close, physical. Breath against breath, hands against throat. A murder method that required him to feel the struggle and continue through it. This makes the incident especially horrifying. The victim is not only attacked, she is forced into the most primitive kind of contest for existence while staring at or sensing the deliberate persistence of the man killing her. There is no comforting abstraction there, no detached mechanism. No emotional distance, just a human body exerting itself to extinguish another. To describe that without sensationalism means staying with the body's last resistance, the sudden violence of survival. Shoulders twisting, knees hitting hard surfaces. Nails, breath. Panic, the involuntary sounds of someone whose world has narrowed to one impossible need. Air, every victim entered that moment with her own history already inside her. A runaway who had survived other men, a mother who still needed to come home. A teenager pretending she was tougher than she felt, an addict whose body had already been asked to endure too much. None of that history could save her there, in the incident. All those different lives were reduced by the killer to one function, an isolated woman in a space he controlled. That reduction is the moral obscenity at the center of the Green River murders. He selected not only vulnerability, but invisibility. And then converted the whole person into a private event with no witness. If the victim lost consciousness before she fully grasped where she was, that is one kind of horror. If she stayed conscious long enough to understand that the road back had already vanished, that is another. Either way, the incident shattered the world at a level smaller and crueler than public memory usually allows. It was not simply murder in the abstract. It was one woman at a time, realizing too late that this man was not operating within any of the usual bargains of the strip. After the killing, the incident did not end. That is one of the most chilling things about Ridgway. The death was not the final act. The body still had to be moved, arranged, hidden, abandoned, and that required a second calm. A practical calm. The car starts again. Or maybe it never stopped. He drives to a riverbank, a patch of woods, an embankment off a service road. A strip of brush that looks meaningless to everyone except the person who has decided it is now a grave. This is where the Pacific Northwest landscape enters the incident as an accomplice of silence. Damp soil, ferns, blackberry thickets, discarded trash, shallow slopes, muddy water, places close enough to roads to reach easily and far enough from the moral center of public life to remain unseen. The victim, who hours earlier was standing in light, speaking, choosing, bargaining, is now being transferred into the geography of disappearance. That movement from road to brush, from person to hidden body, is the second half of the incident. And it is where Ridgway's method reveals its coldest logic. He was not only killing women, he was placing them where he believed they would become difficult to fully recover, difficult to quickly identify, difficult to force into the center of civic concern. Some killers want spectacle. Ridgway wanted delay. Delay in discovery. Delay in recognition. Delay in outrage. Delay was part of the murder. The incident, therefore, stretches beyond the physical attack into the first hours of absence. A woman does not return. A friend thinks she got another date. A child sleeps somewhere else. A mother gets through one more night by telling herself her daughter has done this before. The killer is already back in motion. The victim's world has not yet learned that the ordinary rhythms of waiting no longer apply. That lag, those hours and days before absence becomes alarm, are part of the violence. He depended on them. He trusted them. He lived inside them. In a different kind of city, with different victims. The incident might have exploded outward immediately into sirens and headlines. Here it dissolved first into uncertainty, because uncertainty had already become a normal condition in the lives of the women he hunted. They disappeared before. They drifted. They came back. They vanished for a weekend. They were seen in one motel, then another. Ridgway used that pattern as cover. The incident was never just one man versus one woman. It was one man using the world's habit of delaying concern. That is why every murder in this case feels socially contaminated. The women were not only physically isolated, they were structurally isolated before the crime even began. No matter how the first conversation in the car unfolded, no matter whether she laughed at first, distrusted him, argued, or sat silent, the larger truth remained that she was entering the encounter with less protection than many others would have had. He knew that, maybe not in policy terms or sociological language, but in the practical language that matters most to a predator, who gets missed and for how long. Over time, the incident must have become, for Ridgway, a routine sequence. That is one of the most disturbing features of the case. Not only that he killed, but that he learned from repetition, from successful concealment, from the slow response to missing women, from the fact that each completed murder taught him he could do it again. Routine deadens shock. It makes the impossible practical. The first time he pulled over may have involved one kind of internal friction. By the time the series deepened, the encounter, the drive, the attack, the disposal could become part of a workflow of death. That practical quality is what chills the blood. A serial killer is terrifying in part because he repeats. Ridgway is terrifying because he repeated in ways that allowed him to keep looking like another man in traffic. If one image should close this section, it is not yet the body found in brush. It is the car itself, idling beside the curb on a wet night. Interior dim, driver looking across at a girl under bad light. And the whole enormous future of the case compressed into that tiny pause before she opens the door. In that pause, there is weather, hunger, the illusion of one more ordinary transaction. The entire hierarchy of whose lives are urgently protected and whose are left to bargain with risks, and one man who has already turned all of that into method. When the door opens, the incident begins. Not because death is immediate, but because the world has already shifted out from under her. The road ahead is no longer road, it is corridor. The driver is no longer client, he is sentence. And by the time the city understands what has happened, the rain is already falling over the place where he left her. That is the true shape of the Green River incident. Quiet, repeated, intimate, hidden inside the ordinary exchange that vulnerable women were forced to make every night just to stay alive. And in that quiet lay the real terror. Not a dramatic eruption, but a murder that could begin with the same motions as routine and end with a body absorbed into the landscape before the world had even learned to speak her absence at full volume. There is one more layer to the incident that makes this case almost unbearable to imagine. Many of these women probably recognize danger all the time. Danger was not a revelation in their lives, it was background weather. They knew men could become cruel inside minutes. They knew roads could become traps. They knew how quickly a client's mood could turn, so when Ridgway approached them, he was not confronting untouched innocence. He was confronting women who had already survived too much. That fact should have protected them, and yet it did not. His method was cruelly fitted to that reality. He looked ordinary enough to pass the first test. And he relied on the truth that no one can survive every risk simply by reading faces in the dark. Eventually, somebody gets the wrong car. Eventually, exhaustion, need, or bad luck outpaces instinct. That is part of what the incident steals. Not only life, but the idea that vigilance can save you forever if you are careful enough. These women were often careful. The world simply gave them too many nights in which care had to compete with hunger. Addiction, debt, fear, or the desperate wish to be done for a few hours and go somewhere warm. Ridgway turned that exhausted calculus into opportunity, and after each killing, he could step back into daylight carrying none of the visible residue of the struggle. He could work, speak, nod, and drive as if the previous night had been as empty as any other. That return to normal life belongs to the incident too, because it completes the insult. The victim is gone, hidden in water or brush. while the killer walks back into society wearing the same face it has always accepted. That is why the Green River murders feel less like isolated acts of violence and more like a contamination of the whole region. The road, the strip, the car, the woods. The next morning, all became linked inside one repeating cycle. Every woman who stepped toward a car was stepping toward that cycle without knowing whether this would be another bad night or the one that would erase her from the visible world. Ridgway lived in that uncertainty like a parasite. He fed on the fact that routine and catastrophe could begin with the same small gesture. A passenger door opening under a wet streetlight while traffic moved on and nobody nearby understood that a life had just crossed the line between danger and disappearance forever. That is why every incident feels intimate and social at once. The crime scene in this Green River case did not exist in a single room, under a single lamp, or inside one house whose walls could be measured and sealed. It existed across a whole geography of wet earth and delayed recognition. That is what makes this part of the story so haunting. Investigators were not walking into one contained chamber of horror. They were walking into a region that kept giving the dead back slowly. In pieces, in clusters. In places that had looked unremarkable the day before, the Green River itself was not a dramatic river in the way people imagine from cinema. It was not some gothic black ribbon cutting through a cursed landscape. It was part of the real Pacific Northwest. Brown in places, green around the edges. Practical, ordinary. Crossed by roads, bordered by brush. Threaded through areas where factories, houses, parking lots, and quiet wooded patches existed almost too close together. That ordinariness mattered because when the first bodies were found near the river and in the surrounding terrain, the horror did not announce itself as myth. It announced itself as physical fact. A human form where no human should have been. A young woman where the eye expected only weeds, mud, water, discarded trash, and the indifferent clutter of a working region. The first responders and investigators who moved into those scenes were not entering a mystery that still felt abstract. They were entering a place where the landscape itself had begun to speak in the language of accumulation. One body can be a terrible crime. Several bodies in related places become something else. They become a pattern, and patterns are what change fear into dread. Imagine the first hours of one of those discoveries. Damp air pressing against clothing. The smell of the river and wet vegetation, mud sucking at boots. A detective or deputy moving carefully down an embankment while branches scrape against his jacket. Someone has reported remains, or seen something pale caught in brush, or stumbled into the kind of sight no one mistakes once they are close enough. The body is partly concealed by the world itself, not because nature is merciful, but because nature is busy. Leaves fall. Water rises and drops. Insects arrive. Time does its work. That is one of the cruelest features of the Green River scenes. They were often scenes discovered after nature had already begun to erase and alter, so the investigators were never simply reading a fresh moment of violence. They were reading violence after rain, after rot, after silence, after the dead had been left alone with the landscape longer than anyone should ever be left alone. Every such scene carried not just the murder, but the delay. Delay in discovery, delay in alarm, delay in justice. The first clues were therefore not theatrical clues. They did not come wrapped in letters or carved into walls. They came in the brutal repetition of circumstance. Young female victims, bodies left in or near wooded areas, embankments, riverbanks, roadside brush, a region beginning to produce the same terrible answer again and again to the same question. Where did she go? That repetition was among the earliest and most important clues investigators had. Before science could narrow anything, before a single suspect could be meaningfully isolated, before a name like Ridgway could carry any weight at all, the dead themselves were already drawing a shape on the map. They were telling detectives that these were not disconnected tragedies floating in separate universes. They belonged to one appetite, one method, one mind moving through the same territory with enough confidence to use it repeatedly. The Green River Task Force and other investigators did not have the luxury of treating each scene as self-contained. Every new recovery forced comparison. Distance between locations, type of concealment, proximity to roads, relation to known pickup areas, state of decomposition, clothing, personal effects, injuries, and whatever tiny pieces of evidence the weather had not already thinned out in a single house murder. A room can preserve a sequence, overturned furniture, blood spatter, a broken object, signs of struggle, entry and exit. In the Green River case, the dump sites often preserved something colder and more abstract. Choice. The killer had chosen this patch of brush, this embankment, this cluster of trees, this stretch near water. That choice mattered. It suggested familiarity, mobility, and a willingness to revisit certain areas psychologically, if not physically. Some serial killers seek clean disposal. Ridgway seems to have sought concealment sufficient to delay discovery, not disappearance so perfect that the victim would never be found. That distinction is important. The scenes say something about his confidence. He believed the land and the lives of his victims would buy him time. The terrain did not have to make them vanish forever. It only had to keep them hidden long enough, and often it did. The physical conditions of the Northwest made every recovery more difficult. Rain blurred traces. Mud complicated movement. Water altered bodies. Thick undergrowth obscured lines of sight. Access routes could be awkward enough to make a casual discovery unlikely, but easy enough for someone familiar with the area to enter and leave without drama. That practical balance is one of the first major clues in the case. The killer knew where to place a body so that it would slip out of ordinary view without demanding a complex burial operation. He was using the edges of civilization, not the total wilderness. That told investigators something essential. This was probably someone local, or at least regionally familiar. Someone who understood the relationship between roads and concealment. Someone whose comfort with these in-between spaces suggested repeated movement through them. Another early clue lived in the victims themselves. Many were young. Many were involved in sex work or moving through the same precarious environments around the Strip. Many were runaways or women already living close to homelessness. Addiction, or chronic instability. That pattern was not incidental. It implied victim selection. And victim selection is one of the strongest psychological clues any serial case can offer. The women were not random in the broad social sense. They were being drawn from a specific population, one already exposed to nighttime street contact with strange men in cars. That immediately shifted the frame of the investigation. Detectives could no longer imagine an offender who simply crossed paths by chance with isolated women in unrelated situations. The crime scenes and the victimology together suggested someone who deliberately hunted in a known circuit of vulnerability and then moved victims to disposal sites he understood. The street and the riverbank were becoming linked in the logic of the case. One was the acquisition point. The other was where the region learned. Too late. What had happened? As more scenes accumulated, the emotional burden on investigators deepened. There is a particular dread that comes with serial body recovery. Each scene begins to speak not only for itself, but for all the others. A detective stepping through wet grass toward another set of remains is no longer just processing a crime scene. He is re-entering a pattern. He is seeing the same contempt made material again, the same age range. The same exposure, the same transfer from a living roadside economy into an anonymous patch of earth. The case stops feeling like a set of files and begins to feel like a wound in the landscape. Every ditch or slope starts to look potentially guilty. Every line of brush beside a road asks whether it, too, is holding someone. That psychological spread is part of the crime scene in this case. The whole region becomes charged. Searches are not simply directed toward one address. They become broader, more desperate, more haunted by the possibility that the next hill, the next access road, The next river bend will give up another girl. Some of the first and most heartbreaking clues came from clothing and personal effects. A piece of fabric, jewelry, remnants that might allow identification, that might travel from forensic table back into a family's memory. She wore that color. She had earrings like that. She owned a ring with that stone. This is where the crime scene becomes almost unbearable. Because evidence is not just evidence, it is recognition. It is the moment when a mother or sister understands that the abstract fear of what might have happened has become physical. Yet even when identification was possible, the scenes still resisted neat reading. Time and exposure had damaged context. A body found in brush cannot always tell investigators exactly where the fatal assault happened, how long the car was parked, what words were spoken, whether the victim tried to run, whether there was bargaining, pleading, silence. Much of that vanished with the weather. So the early clues were strong in pattern, but weak in singular detail. Strong enough to terrify, weak enough to frustrate. The killer's most important advantage lay right there. He was leaving bodies, but not leaving the kind of evidence that quickly hands over a face. In a sense, the landscape was doing part of the concealment work for him. One of the earliest and most disturbing implications of the scenes was that some dump sites appeared to have been reused or approached in a manner suggesting increasing confidence. That possibility mattered a great deal. It hinted not just at a killer who knew the terrain, but at one who felt ownership over certain hidden spaces. Ownership is perhaps the wrong word in any moral sense, but in the mind of a serial predator it matters. To return to the same kinds of locations is to turn the landscape into a private system, a map of disposal, a memory palace of contempt. Whether Ridgway literally revisited bodies or simply favored similar types of locations, the scenes pointed toward a man growing comfortable with what he was doing. That comfort is itself a clue. It separates the offender from the panicked accidental killer who dumps a body in the first place available and never repeats. Here, repeated choices were shaping a signature of practical hatred. The relationship between the crime scenes and public understanding evolved slowly. At first, even as police began to suspect a serial pattern, the broader culture still carried all its old assumptions about missing women on the strip. This is why the discovery phase is morally so charged. The bodies were teaching one lesson while parts of the world still wanted to hear another. The land was saying these women were hunted. Some institutions and social attitudes were still tempted to answer. These girls lived dangerous lives. Both statements can be true. But only one of them points toward justice. The other points toward blame disguised as realism. The crime scenes forced that distinction into the open, no matter what life a victim had been living. What the riverbank held was evidence of homicide, repetition, and predation. The women were not simply casualties of their own circumstances. They had been selected, overpowered, killed, and placed. That is what the woods and water were saying. Another major clue in the early phase was the emerging timeline. Once investigators started linking disappearances to recoveries and mapping dates, the case gained a rhythm. Bodies were not appearing randomly across decades with no relation to one another. The scenes, taken together, reflected an active period of predation. That helped narrow the idea of the offender. This was someone functioning in the area over time. Someone whose routine allowed repeated access to the strip and enough private mobility to transport victims afterward. The killer was not likely a drifter passing through once. He belonged, somehow, to the flow of the region. The roads were not just roads to him. They were part of his operating environment. That would become crucial later. But even early on, it was there in the scenes themselves, how close they lay to road networks. How often they sat in that uncanny space between public land and hidden pocket, not far from where ordinary life kept moving. Perhaps the most terrible feature of these crime scenes is how little spectacle they contained compared with how much horror they represented. No dramatic tableau. No message written for the press. No openly staged symbol. Just women left in places where the earth could work on them. That plainness can make people underestimate the psychological violence of the scenes. But in fact, it deepens it. The killer did not need theatrics because the insult was already total. He treated the victims as bodies that could be removed from the road, used, killed, and set down among weeds and mud as if the world might take a while to notice the difference. There is a bleak efficiency in that. It tells investigators they are dealing with someone who sees these women as matter to be relocated, not as people whose disappearance will summon immediate and overwhelming consequence. That dehumanization was not abstract. It was written directly into the geography of the disposal. Every body found where no one should have been left was a statement about how little the killer believed her life would be loudly defended. The crime scenes, then, were not only physical sights, they were moral declarations. They said he thinks no one is coming quickly enough. They said he thinks these girls can vanish into rain and brush. They said he has done this before. If one image should close this part, it is not the dramatic overhead map or the task force briefing, though those matter. It is something lower and quieter, a detective crouching in wet undergrowth, gloved hand parting branches, flashlight beam catching pale evidence where nature has tried to reclaim the shape. The air smells of river water and rot. The road is not far away, though from here it might as well be another world. Behind that detective stand, all the girls already missing, all the mothers waiting, all the reports that did not feel urgent enough soon enough. Ahead of him lies another clue, another body, another reminder that the case is not one disappearance but a system. The landscape is speaking now, over and over, and what it says is terrible in its clarity. A man is hunting women here. He knows the roads. He knows the ground. He knows exactly which lives the world is slowest to fight for. And until someone stops him, the river and the brush will keep learning their names before the public does. That is the discovery at the heart of the Green River case. Not one shocking room, but an entire region forced to admit that its edges had become a burial ground. And once that admission was made, every patch of wet earth felt like a question the world had already delayed too long. The investigation into Gary Ridgway became a study in how a killer can live for years inside plain sight when the world around his victims is already frayed by neglect. By the time police and task force members fully grasped that they were facing one of the largest serial murder cases in American history, the pattern had already dug itself deep into the Seattle-Tacoma corridor. Bodies had been recovered. Young women were missing. Families were trapped between hope and dread. Detectives were staring at maps where clusters of dump sites seemed to pulse like infected wounds across King County. And still, the man responsible kept going to work, driving the same roads as everyone else, blending into traffic, carrying his life in the same ordinary frame that allowed him to remain almost invisible. That is the true heart of this part of the story, not a lack of effort, and not a simple failure of intelligence, but the brutal collision between a determined investigation and a killer who understood exactly where society looked least urgently. The first problem was the victims themselves, or rather the way institutions were trained to read their lives. Many of the missing women were teenagers, runaways, sex workers, or women already caught in addiction. Their disappearances did not always arrive in police hands as clean emergencies with stable routines, clear last sightings, and families who could document every hour. Some of these girls had vanished before and come back. Some moved between friends, motels, shelters, and streets. Some had estranged parents, frightened parents, or exhausted parents who had already spent months or years trying to pull them back from danger. That instability did not make their lives less valuable. It made the investigation harder, and it gave Ridgway time. Every hour in which a disappearance could still be explained as one more drift into the same old chaos was an hour in which the killer was protected by the shape of the victim's life. That is one of the ugliest truths in the entire case. Ridgway did not merely hide from police. He hid inside a culture that had already learned to shrug too quickly at certain missing girls. The second problem was the environment. The Seattle area and the roads stretching south toward Tacoma gave investigators too much territory and too little certainty. Pickup points were scattered along Pacific Highway South. Dump sites could be near rivers, embankments, thickets, access roads, or wooded pockets. A victim could be seen by one person on the strip, get into a car with another, disappear into traffic, and end up miles away in a location that might not yield a body for months. Unlike a house where blood, fibers, and impact points preserve a moment, the Green River scenes were often partial, delayed, altered by weather and wildlife. Detectives had to reconstruct crimes through absences, through movement, through geography, through the logic of a man who rarely left the kind of immediate forensic evidence that would hand them his name. The task force did what serious investigators do when the landscape itself becomes part of the crime. They built maps. They built timelines. They interviewed families, sex workers, pimps, Johns, employers, friends, boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, and anyone else who might have seen one of the missing women in the last hours before she slipped out of the visible world. They flooded the strip with undercover work and surveillance. They tried to identify repeated vehicles, repeated faces, repeated habits, but that created its own dead end. There were too many men, too many drivers slowing at night, too many customers who could not be neatly separated into harmless and dangerous, too many violent men who hit women, frightened women, used women, and left them alive. Ridgway did not stand out enough from that landscape of male predation because he operated inside its ordinary ugliness. He looked like one more man in a car, one more working stiff, one more face a woman might bargain with because she needed money before dawn. That made him harder to isolate than a theatrical predator would have been. Even when suspicion began to sharpen, the case remained flooded with possible offenders. Serial investigations are often imagined as elegant hunts for one extraordinary mind, but the Green River case was for a long time a swamp of partial men. Men with records for assault, men seen talking to victims, men with bizarre sexual histories, men reported by women on the strip as frightening or strange, men who drove the same areas night after night, men whose alibis almost worked, men who seemed plausible until the dates broke, until a witness changed a detail, until a lab result came back empty, until another body turned up in a place that did not fit. Each suspect consumed hours, interviews, surveillance, paperwork, hope, and doubt. Each near miss left the same exhausted question hanging over the investigators. Are we circling him again and failing to know it? The pressure on police was enormous because the case was no longer simply local. The number of victims, the media attention, and the fear moving through the region transformed the investigation into a public test of competence, urgency, and moral seriousness. Every new body deepened that pressure. Every young woman found in brush or near water accused the task force of being too late again. Even when the people working the case were sacrificing sleep, marriages, and mental clarity to keep up, that is another important part of the dead end. The detectives were not relaxed, indifferent, or blind in any simple sense. Many were obsessed. They were living with walls covered in photographs of girls who should still have been alive. They were absorbing grief from family after family. They were walking into rooms where mothers still believed a daughter might call, and then walking out carrying notes that suggested she was almost certainly gone. The frustration came not from apathy, but from the fact that every correct instinct still had to pass through the bottleneck of proof. And proof kept slipping away. Ridgway himself entered the suspect pool relatively early. This is one of the most maddening elements of the case. He was not some last-minute revelation who emerged only when science advanced far beyond the imagination of earlier investigators. Police talked to him. They looked at him. He became a person of interest. He had contact with sex workers. He drove the right roads. He fit aspects of the victim pattern. Women described him, or men like him, yet suspicion is not conviction. And in the era before DNA could decisively bind him to one of the murders, detectives were left in the terrible in-between. They could feel the shape of him before they could pin him down. He answered questions. He denied. He kept working. He kept living, and the burden remained on investigators to move from a plausible man among many plausible men to the man. There were physical clues, of course, but they did not resolve cleanly. Fibers, paint transfers, tire marks, witness recollections, behavioral patterns. All of these contributed to the case, but serial murder investigations do not close on atmosphere. They close when atmosphere meets evidence hard enough to survive scrutiny. In the Green River case, that meeting took years. The task force also had to contend with a problem more human than technical: memory. Witnesses on the Strip were often traumatized, intoxicated, suspicious of police, or living lives so unstable that details blurred together. Cars looked similar, men sounded similar, nights merged into one another. A woman might remember a mustache, a truck, a name maybe, a type of work boot, a smell, a vague sense that one customer wanted to talk too much or knew the roads too well. Those impressions mattered, but none of them alone could end the case. The investigation thus became a kind of grinding attrition. Build the file, recheck the file, compare one witness to another, re-interview, revisit body sites, follow up on another tip, reassess another suspect, hope for one mistake, wait for one crack. Meanwhile, the killer understood, consciously or not, that his chosen victims moved through a world already crowded with danger, and that this noise protected him. Another dead end came from the scale of public fear. Once the term Green River Killer entered the public imagination, the case began to attract not only useful information, but also fantasy, rumor, attention-seeking calls, psychics, fringe theories, and the desperate human need to make an enormous crime feel answerable. Some people thought the killer had to be a truck driver, others a policeman, others a man who hunted in the woods, others a religious zealot, others someone visibly monstrous. Ridgway did not satisfy those fantasies. He was more disappointing and therefore harder to believe in. That banality helped him. He did not carry the theatrical aura people often expect from a nightmare of this size. He could be sloppy, boring, ordinary, and still murderous on a scale that defied imagination. That mismatch between the mythic killer the public wanted and the dull local man who actually fit the case added one more layer of haze. In many ways, the Green River investigation became a test of whether investigators could keep trusting the smallest, ugliest truths over the more dramatic theories. There were also the institutional limits of the era. The Green River Task Force became one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. But size does not remove limitation. Files can overwhelm. Leads can age. Personnel changes. Priorities shift. Political pressure fluctuates. Public attention surges and fades. The women, however, stayed dead, and the families stayed waiting. Over time, the investigation itself became a living thing, almost a city inside the city. Consuming evidence, interviews, theories, and emotional endurance. Detectives passed information to one another, revisited old assumptions, and fought the crushing possibility that the killer might have already sat in an interview room across from them and walked out again. With Ridgway, that possibility was not abstract, it was real. He had been near the center without the case yet being able to close around him. That is what makes this part of the story feel almost unbearable in hindsight. Not because nobody looked, but because they looked and still could not yet stop him. The major breakthrough that would eventually destroy the dead end did not come from a confession, a witness suddenly remembering a license plate with perfect clarity, or some melodramatic collapse under questioning. It came from time and science. Biological evidence collected and preserved from victims years earlier finally became more useful as DNA analysis advanced. That progression should be understood as both triumph and indictment. Triumph because it shows how patient evidence can outlive a killer's confidence. Indictment because it means that the answer was, in one sense, already sleeping in storage while women had long since died. When the science matured enough to compare Ridgway's DNA to evidence recovered from victims, the in-between ended. The file, the maps, the witness statements, the interviews, the suspicion, all of it could finally attach to something harder than intuition. It could attach to his body, but before that moment, investigators lived in the dead end for years. They knew they were hunting someone local enough, methodical enough, and emotionally dead enough to keep using the same roads, the same victim pool, and the same geography. They just could not yet close their hands around him. There was a final cruelty built into that long stalemate. Families were asked, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, to keep trusting a process that could not yet give them the one thing they needed most: certainty. Each press conference, each renewed search, each announcement of another suspected victim created a strange double movement of hope and devastation. Hope that the case was moving. Devastation